Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. If you've not already done so, please silence your phones. Join us this Sunday, October 6th at 1 p.m. here in this space for a Fannie Lou Hamer birthday celebration. Civil rights movement veteran Charles McLaurin will discuss his experiences with Mrs. Hamer. Remember also that admission to these museums is free every Sunday. The traveling exhibit Atomic Alert, Confronting the Bomb in the New Atomic Age, has opened upstairs. Next week for History is Lunch, we'll have the exhibit's curator, Michael Streisguth, with us to present Protecting the Home Front, Women in Civil Defense, 1950 to 1960. And then he'll also give a gallery talk on a related but different focus on the exhibit, or in the exhibit, the next morning, Thursday morning at 11 a.m., so come back for that. Today, I am delighted to welcome Fergus Bordewich to present Grant, the KKK, and the War for Reconstruction in Mississippi. Fergus Bordewich has been an independent writer, historian, and journalist since the early 1970s. He is the author of the book Klan War, oh, and I dropped the excellent but extended subhead on that, I apologize, and 8 previous nonfiction books, including Congress at War, How Republican Reformers Fought the Civil War, Defied Lincoln, Ended Slavery, and Remade America, The First Congress, which won the D.B. Hardeman Prize in American History, and America's Great Debate, Henry Clay, Stephen A. Douglas, and the Compromise That Preserved the Union, which the Los Angeles Times named the best history book of 2012. Bordewich holds degrees from the City College of New York and Columbia University. In 2015, he chaired the awards committee for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize given by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Help me welcome to the stage Fergus Bordewich.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm not sounding too loud out there. No? Okay. I want to thank the Archives, the Department of Archives, for having me here, Chris Goodwin in particular for making this happen. And I had the great pleasure just before this of kind of at breakneck speed going through the History Museum, which when I last saw it was sort of wedged into the old Capitol building and was a lot smaller. And as quick as my visit was, what a spectacular museum. I've visited many state history museums because I love to see how states present themselves, and I thought this is just fabulous. We're packed with interesting material and just beautifully curated and so on. Okay. Before I start, I'm going to read. This is the only thing I'm going to read from the book. It's very short, and my preference would have been to read it at the end, but I realize I typically find myself running out of time and not having time to read this. But what it is, this is a few words from the great black historian W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, Black Reconstruction, which was published in 1935. Terrific book, dropped like a ton of lead because in 1935, nobody was paying attention to serious books written by black historians. Wonderful book, it holds up. And here's what he said. One is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, or skimmed over. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive or an example. It paints perfect men and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth. If we are going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as a science or as an art. And look, the story of the war against the Klan, and more broadly of the entire Reconstruction era, asks Americans to face some harsh truths. This is not simple history, and it's not pleasant history. It's tough history. And if there's one, there are many lessons to be learned from that era, but one of them, and I think it's a lasting one, which we all need to remember, no matter where we may be on the political spectrum, is that rights that have once been gained can also be taken away. And this is part of our history too, you know. And it also, this history shows pretty vividly that racial terrorism is as inescapable a part of the country's heritage as many other themes that make us feel a lot better, rightfully so, about the United States and its democratic achievements. And finally, and darkly I have to say, it's a reminder that the United States, the United States, as pretty much anywhere else in the world, because we're all human beings, is that barbarism may lay only a small distance beneath the skin of civilization. Okay, so I'm not going to spend the next 40 minutes depressing you. Okay, I promise. In fact, the trajectory of what I have to say here pretty much is an upward trajectory, because I'm going to talk about how Ulysses Grant beat the Klan, and he did. I mean, I think we're by and large generally, or let's not say us, let's say many people, many Americans are accustomed to thinking or having been taught that Reconstruction was a failure. Oh my God, it was just a mess and a failure. It was not a failure. The Klan arose because Reconstruction was succeeding. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a few minutes. But I want to make it clear also, I think you probably already know this, that there were 3 iterations of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the first one that I'm talking about, the original Ku Klux Klan, the one that was the model for the later ones that came in the 20th century. The Klan I'm talking about flourished from the late 1860s into the early 1860s, and it was defeated. It ended. The Klan era ended. Okay? Terrorism didn't necessarily end. Intimidation of voters and so on did not end. But the Klan was defeated. And the more familiar iterations of the Klan, for most of us, are one, the Klan of the 1910s and 20s, the only terrorist movement in the world that was inspired by a movie. There was Birth of a Nation, which I imagine most of you have seen. It's a brilliant, horrible movie. Brilliantly made, horrible in its values. The Klan was reinvented based on what was seen in the movie, okay? And it flourished for 10 years, dynamically successful, and then it collapsed because it was just saturated with internal corruption, okay? And then the third Klan developed in the 1950s and 60s, and in fragmentary form, it's still with us today. And there was 2 later iterations, essentially based their idea on the theatrics and trappings and the legend of the original Klan. Okay. So, as far as this gentleman goes, just roughly judging by what people I see here, many of you are roughly in my generation, which means you were probably taught in school. If you were learned anything about Grant, he was a failure. He was a terrible president, maybe the worst president. Commonly ranked right near the bottom for a couple of generations. And however, Grant's standing, his reputation has been, within the last generation, dramatically rising. Okay, there have been a number of full-scale biographies of Grant. Ron Chernow's is one many people have read. Another one by Charles Calhoun about his presidency. First rate. There are others as well. And most importantly to me here is that if you view Grant through the lens of civil rights, the racial politics of the time, and the urgency of dealing with the crisis of Reconstruction, Grant was one of the best presidents viewed through that lens. Most historians, and I tend to agree, place him in kind of now around the upper middle. But anyway, that's kind of a game anyway, who was best, who was worst. But at any rate, my point is that Grant, in a certain way, was yet another victim of Jim Crow, or more specifically, the anti-Reconstruction historians who dominated the field until the 1960s, and who demonized Grant because they demonized Reconstruction, because they demonized the rights of African Americans. It all followed. And what Grant had accomplished, they did not want to remember. And by the way, those anti-Reconstruction historians were not regional historians, they were national historians. Alan Nevins, a New Englander, who was the paramount pro-union historian of the Civil War era until the 60s, was guilty of the same thing. Okay, so it's important to I'm sure everybody here who knows who this gentleman is Hiram Revels. Reconstruction embodied a racial revolution. Not just a racial revolution, an economic revolution, a revolution in rights, in the national conception of rights and who had the authority to enforce them. Okay, revolution is not a pejorative. It's not a rhetorical word. It's what was happening. It's an appropriate word, and it was seen that way both by the reactionaries who formed the Ku Klux Klan and the so-called Redeemer movements, but also by those who were trying to make Reconstruction a reality, and who included both African Americans and white Americans. I want to make a point here because it's a political point that's very essential to understand, which is that initially the post-Civil War Republican Party, pre-Civil War, it was a regional party in the North. Post-Civil War, the former Confederate states became a two-party democracy for the first time in realistic terms. And the Southern Republican Party was biracial, well, the National Party too, but where it really mattered was here in the Southern states. It was biracial. There were lots and lots of white Southerners in the Republican Party at the beginning who joined with Black Americans, formerly enslaved people, freed people, Northern African Americans who came down to help build a new society and economy in the South. And the fact that it was biracial was one of the things that provoked the savagery of the reaction that was embodied in the Ku Klux Klan. And initially, white Mississippians and others spanned a very wide spectrum, and it's quite evident when you research the conflict of this period that we're talking about here, ranging from former there's beleaguered wartime Unionists in these states who had to keep their heads down, try to stay alive. But also plenty of former Confederates who said, we should have lost because we were wrong. And there were plenty. Some were soldiers, some were officers. There were white working class people who knew they had been discriminated against by the kind of aristocratic systems that were fairly typical in the pre-war Southern states. And affluent, sometimes elite, very well-educated white Southerners. They were not a majority, obviously, but that part of the Southern Republican parties was much more diverse than I think has generally been recognized or admitted. And the alliance with black Americans was radical and revolutionary and extraordinary. The Southern Republican Party was really the first biracial political party in history, American history. Okay, so keep that in mind as I'm talking here. But the most exciting and dynamic aspect socially of what's happening in Reconstruction, of course, is the explosion of men like Hiram Revels into public life, and the grassroots activism among black Southerners, mostly former slaves, but not always. Many. This gentleman was never enslaved. He was born free in North Carolina. He was an AME minister and missionary. That's how he wound up in Mississippi. But the voices of formerly enslaved people fill the public square in this explosion of civil rights conventions and mutual aid societies and newspaper reading circles and book reading circles and political study groups and the explosive growth of the Union League, which is what it sounded. It was a initially biracial, ultimately primarily black organization that came into existence to help provide civic education and then organization for formerly enslaved people. And at least 2,000 African Americans, somewhat more than that actually, won election to or were appointed to public office from a multitude of local offices, town clerks, sheriffs, bursars, tax collectors, you name it, all the way up to the U.S. Congress. And Revels, of course, was the first black member of the U.S. Senate in 1870. He was only in for a year. The appointment was for a year. He wasn't ousted. And the illiterate flocked to schools. It's an incredible phenomenon. The determination of enslaved people to become literate and to read, because everybody knew that was the route to being able to participate in society. And workers are demanding fair wages, and protesters are defying segregation, and railroads and steamboats and black newspapers are being founded, and small black businesses that become bigger businesses are being created as well. And Republicans, and I'm now talking about the National Party, Republicans believed that Reconstruction was irreversible. They thought that former Confederates would acquiesce peacefully, if maybe reluctantly, in this new reality. Well, they were dreaming, obviously. And I'm going to quote a man who's a Tennessean and a former wartime Unionist, which underscores the point, who said in 1865, and you can hear this kind of voice throughout resistant, white, unreconstructible Southerners. The Negroes are no more free than they were 4 years ago. He said this in 1865. They're no more free than they were 4 years ago, and if anyone goes about the country telling them that, shoot him. And this is the spirit of the Ku Klux Klan. And almost as soon as the war ended, scattered white resistance groups began to form under different names, kind of exotic names usually. Typically, they were made up of former Confederate soldiers and men who before the war had been patrollers. That's to say, they'd been salaried by counties and towns to catch fugitive slaves. Horrendous localized violence was perpetrated against black public officials and white Republicans as well. There were massacres in Memphis and New Orleans and elsewhere. Black Americans fought back where they could, but without protection. This is in the very early years of Reconstruction. They were mostly at the mercy of mobs. And I want to show you this picture for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's a very intense picture. It appeared in, I think, Harper's Monthly. And what you see here, obviously, is an armed black man with the bodies of murdered African Americans strewn around him. And the text up here is essentially racist propaganda, saying this is what he's up against. Okay. At the same time, the image shows a man who is, frankly, it's a bit of a racist trope, which is to say, he looks a little frightening. Not just a man defending his defenseless family, let's say, but this can be seen by different people in different ways. So I find it a problematic image, but I think it communicates a lot. Okay. I think this speaks for itself here. There's nothing mysterious about the Ku Klux Klan's origins. It was founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, which is a town, rather pleasant little town today, about 70 miles south of Nashville. And it was started as a kind of Confederate veterans fraternity. And it wasn't initially a violent, murderous organization. It was a fraternity. These young guys were bored. They had nothing much to do. There was nothing much going on in Pulaski, so they invented this organization, dressed up in odd costumes, and they performed surprise antics around town. One of the things that they found particularly amusing, and this is the germ of what becomes Klan terrorism, is harassing African Americans who were assertive in the town of Pulaski. Now, nobody in this very early period was violently attacked, but people were embarrassed, humiliated, belittled, and so on. This was joking, the guys in this early Ku Klux Klan. This sort of stuff spread very rapidly around that part of Tennessee, and in about 6 months, there was a meeting in Nashville of former high-ranking Confederate officers who saw the metastasizing of this organization, said, we can do something with this. And there was a meeting. It's fairly well documented. Well, it's quite well documented, actually. There were no minutes, unfortunately, as an historian. It's very frustrating. You don't know who said what, except you know what happened. And they systematically set out to turn this funky organization into a political organization that employed terrorism to reach its ends. From the beginning, terror wasn't a side effect of the Ku Klux Klan. It was the movement's core. Its aim was to scare African Americans and white Republicans away from the ballot box, destroy the two-party system in the South, which was frail and embryonic, and to restore white supremacy. The term white supremacy, I'm not projecting a term that we use a lot today back into the past. This is that's when it developed as a common term, and it was essentially, if they'd had bumpers in those days, it would have been a bumper sticker. It was a banner, it was a slogan, a primary slogan of the so-called Redeemer movements. That's to say, the reactionary efforts to roll back biracial government and Reconstruction. And from the beginning, the Klan's victims were usually the best educated, the most assertive and outspoken black leaders. Terror was effective. Intimidated juries wouldn't convict, and trials were a farce. Well, half the jurors might be Klansmen. They might all be Klansmen. The judge might be a Klansman. I mean, this isn't speculative. I mean, this is very well documented. They often were. Frightened witnesses wouldn't testify. If they did testify, not infrequently, they were tortured or murdered. And jailed Klansmen were broken free from jail as a matter of course. Let's see. Okay. There's another person I imagine you know. Nathan Bedford Forrest has been treated by many as a heroic war leader, and left at that. Okay. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a pre-war slave trader in Memphis. He made a fortune trading in human beings, men, women, and children. That's what he did. He was good at it. He liked it. Made him rich. He did become an officer, a very talented cavalry officer in the Confederate Army. People who only want to look at his military campaigns still continue to honor him. He was also a war criminal at Fort Pillow, a federal fort north of Memphis in 1864. His troops massacred, and I don't mean just beat in battle, they massacred, shot federal troops, the great majority of them black, but many were also white Tennessee Unionists. They perpetrated extreme cruelty on some of the people they killed. Very, very well documented. There was an investigation from Washington soon afterward. There's testimony. It's online, by the way. I'm not going to dwell on that. But that's Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest is invited to become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. He wasn't the founder. It's sometimes said that he founded it. He didn't. He was invited because he was charismatic. He was famous. He was, to some degree, a figurehead within the reactionary movement. But he was also more than that. And his precise activities are hard to describe precisely. However, that's partly because he just lied uninhibitedly about what he knew and what he did, as did all Klan leaders, by the way. They felt no compunction whatsoever to tell the truth to federal authorities about anything, which is sadly understandable. When Forrest was questioned by Congress, he claimed that there was no such organization as the Klan. He said, just some wild young men who were acting up. Boys will be boys, basically, even if the result is murder. But to a friendly reporter, he boasted that he could call up 50,000 armed men if he chose to. I believe that primarily he pioneered the organized application of terror, adapting the hit-and-run style of cavalry warfare that he practiced during the war, but now against unarmed civilians instead of Yankee soldiers. In short, he taught the Klan how to wage guerrilla war. I also think he served as the Klan's paramount organizer, especially in 67 and 68. He was sort of like a reactionary Johnny Appleseed, planting new Klan dens, as they were called, wherever he traveled. And he was nominally a general traveling agent for a Memphis insurance company. It was a cover. And wherever he went, the Klan seemed to magically appear, and very soon afterward, violence ensued. How many, an obvious question is, how big was the Klan? How many men were in it? Nobody actually knows, okay? I think a reasonable estimate, very reasonable, is in the low couple of 100,000, spread across at least 10 states, 11 states. You have to add Kentucky, which was a Union state during the war, but then became a Confederate state after the war. I'm being facetious, obviously, but there's an excellent book by Ann Marshall, who's here at Mississippi State, on that exact subject. And it's almost the title of her book. I recommend it. Anyway, I think there's a perception that the people who joined the Klan were, they were kind of louts and hoodlums anyway, so, really kind of the losers. Well, it's not so, actually. The Klan was led everywhere, generally by leading men in their communities. Lawyers, doctors, journalists, churchmen, more affluent landowners, sheriffs, judges, people like that were the leaders, and many of the rank and file as well. Yes, of course, lots were farmers, small farmers, independent farmers, many, but by no means all had been slave owners before. And they were as I said earlier, mostly, but not entirely, Confederate veterans, or their younger brothers who didn't make it into the war. Anyway, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery is determined after, as you would probably know, exhaustive research that a minimum of about 2,000 freed people were murdered during this period. And the actual numbers undoubtedly much higher because so many people died anonymously, so to speak. Their deaths weren't written down by journalists or historians or anybody else. And you read there's an abundance of documentation of letters and reports of a body found on a road. I mean, these are virtually always black men, sometimes women, sometimes children. So many doubtless went unrecorded. So 2,000 is a baseline. And so as long as Andrew Johnson remained president, Andrew Johnson, as you know, was actually never a Republican. He was an East Mississippi Unionist Democrat. And he saw his political future after 1865 as building a kind of coalition between Northern Democrats and Southern former Confederates. Okay, it didn't work for him politically, but it meant he had very little interest, almost no interest, in actually enforcing Reconstruction in the South or promoting it. And where there was enforcement, it was primarily coming from the Army. Now, there's a kind of myth that the former Confederate states were under this massive federal military occupation. This is a myth that suits the lost cause mentality, but it's not a true thing. In 1865, at the end of hostilities, there were about 1 million federal soldiers under arms in the former Confederate states. By 1868, there were 12,000. 12,000 spread over 11 former Confederate states, plus Kentucky, and about a third of that number were in Texas, facing west toward Indian country. You're talking about an insignificant number of troops, mostly based in railroad junctions and state capitals. So their ability to protect freed people through those who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau was very, very, very limited. Okay, so it's another one of the reasons why this kind of unbridled violence could continue. Now, here in Mississippi, Republican activists, black and white, were murdered. Homes and schools were burned down. Teachers were flogged, driven away, lynched. Black voters were seized and whipped until they swore that they'd vote Democratic. Just a couple of quick examples here. I have so many in the book, but I don't want to snow you with these examples. In Lee County, a freedman named Tobe Hutchinson was dragged from his cabin by masked men and murdered. His family were too frightened to even collect his body. In Aberdeen, 2 brothers named Flint, who'd been arrested for having an altercation, just an argument, with a white man, were seized from the town jail. They were arrested. The other guy wasn't, of course. From town jail by 50 masked Klansmen, taken into the countryside and butchered. A man named Jack Dupre, the president of a local Republican club, was taken from his bed in the night, beaten, stripped naked, and cut open from throat to crotch, and thrown into a river. And there are hundreds of these stories. I think I'll say a word here about, a quick word about sources. Virtually everything in this book is from original research, from local archives in many places, in various states, state archives, town archives, and so on. And the U.S. Grant Papers, up there, their home is Mississippi State, up the road, and fabulous source, by the way. And all those letters that I just alluded to were from the Grant Papers. In the Grant, because people are writing to Grant. Friends, survivors, wives, parents of the murdered are writing to Grant, say, please do something. But an invaluable source, and it's accessible by anyone because it's accessible online, is a something called, a report. It's a joint congressional report into the conditions in the insurrection in the former Confederate States. 13 volumes. It's 13 volumes, about 6,000 pages, small print. All of it is first-person testimony in real time. Congressional subcommittees came down, and they traveled through Mississippi, they traveled through nearly all the former Confederate states taking testimony. It's a joint committee, so you're getting testimony, one, from victims, people who survived Klan attacks, or their family members, people who sometimes walked 50 miles to give testimony to the Congressional Committee. Finally, there's somebody here who will listen to me. You'll hear this in the testimony. But there's also testimony from Klan members, like Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was interviewed, and apologists for the Klan. Why? Because being a joint committee, it was composed of both Republicans who were oriented towards the victims and Democrats who were oriented towards the perpetrators. You have to flip the parties to understand what was going on at the time. So that's available. All those pages are available. It makes incredible reading. You know, the print is small. I have to tell you, so it's a bit of a strain. But Library of Congress, American Memory, it's in there. Anyway, so what do I have next here? Well, this is the Klan in action. It's obviously an artist's rendering, but what he's rendering is what is described over and over and over of Klansmen bursting into a cabin because people were isolated. This is the America of the 1860s and 70s. People live, especially in the South, live in hamlets. They're vulnerable. They have no one to defend them. Everybody is vulnerable. States, by the way, I should have said this, are afraid to enroll black militia. They're afraid to enroll black men with guns, even where there are Republican Reconstruction governments in the South. A couple of states do. South Carolina does, Arkansas does, but by and large they won't. They won't. They're afraid of the effect this will have on the white population. You know, think back to that image of the man with the gun I showed you a little while ago. So at any rate, it's in this atmosphere that Grant becomes president in early 1869. And Grant is a remarkable man. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with Grant. You know, I can't really claim to have gotten to know somebody who's been dead for 150 years, but you can try. You can try. And his personality, he's very shy. He's a very shy man. He was introverted. He was not an overly expressive individual. He was not a self-promoter. He wasn't self-aggrandizing. He was not a natural politician. He was a natural soldier, it turned out, obviously. He was never an abolitionist, but his father was. So that tells you something about the values that he at least grew up with. But he grew up in Ohio. He grew up in an America, pre-war America, where slavery was pretty much taken for granted. And he married into a slave-owning family. If you ever have a chance to visit the Grant Farm up there near St. Louis, it's a great visit. It's a National Park Service site. Really first rate. And you learn that's where the people who were enslaved by Grant's wife's family were. And the presentation on that is very, very good up there. But he saw from the beginning that the war was going to destroy slavery, and he welcomed that destruction. Unlike many other senior federal generals, William T. Sherman, his best subordinate, was an out-and-out, dyed-in-the-wool racist. And blunt about it. He wouldn't have any black troops in his armies. Grant welcomed black troops. He said, of course they're going to fight. They're going to be good. And they were. He also, even early in the war, welcomed fugitive slaves into his camps where they were protected and given work, unlike many, many other federal commanders who didn't. They returned fugitives to their owners. This is in 1861-62, before the Emancipation Proclamation. Almost without realizing it, after Johnson becomes president, Grant becomes a radical. He didn't decide to be a radical. It just came inexorably because of what he saw happening. He saw the nation losing the peace that he had won in the war because of the campaign of, by now, the Klan, unbridled Klan, against not just African Americans, but against the constitutional freedoms that he believes that all Americans deserve to have. He supports the 14th Amendment wholeheartedly. And he goes to Capitol Hill and advocates for the 15th Amendment, which was quite a radical thing to do at the time. He appointed the first black ambassadors, 2 of them. He abolished segregation among visitors to the White House. I mean, that doesn't sound like much maybe, but it was a pretty big deal when it happened. He said, no, they're Americans. Because in those days, anybody could walk in and talk to the president, by the way. Hard to realize. So people would just show up at the White House and sit down and say, well, I'd like to talk to Grant, if you don't mind. And say, well, just wait. And they'd see people. Lincoln complains endlessly about it during the Civil War. Anyway, so Grant is inundated with these letters I alluded to before, and I've read you a couple. I don't think I'll read any more. Local government's breaking down everywhere. From here in Mississippi, federal Judge Robert Hill, who has a long career during Reconstruction and goes from being a pretty forceful and decisive federal judge to being essentially a collaborator with what becomes the white supremacist structure because he likes being a judge, you know. But at any rate, I'm being harsh on him, but he deserves it, I said to say. Anyway, he wrote, but this is early on, he says, this disaffection is not a thing to be overcome by wooing, by conciliation, he means. Enough of that has already been done in vain. It will only disappear before an energetic exercise of power. Do something. Do something. By 1870-71, Grant was persuaded, and he undertakes what I've alluded to here, as I've described in my book, as the Klan War, the war against the Klan. And his field commander was this gentleman, Amos Ackerman. I mean, he doesn't look very imposing. It's the only image that I've been able to find of him. Born in New Hampshire, spent his entire professional life in Georgia, however. Before the war, owned slaves, not a lot. He was a lawyer, became a lawyer, but he was also a farmer. And he was a very reluctant Confederate. He was a supply officer, which was the minimum that they could make him do. But after the war, he readily embraced the Republican Party. He happily freed the people who were enslaved to him, and he embraced the entire menu of Reconstruction. And he was an idealist. And it's typical in some ways of the complexity of people, white Southerners, who made a very, very difficult moral decision to turn against what they had been. Okay, these are people who were smeared as being so-called scalawags. I dislike that word. I dislike the word carpetbagger. These are smear words. That's how they were coined, and I prefer not to use them. But he wholeheartedly, he was a deeply religious man, very religious, and he saw what had happened in religious terms. And he came to see readily slavery as having been immoral. He regretted having participated in it. And he became, as I said, the legal field commander for the war against the Klan. He leads the new Justice Department. The Justice Department was created in large part to carry out this war against the Klan. Not only, but before that, yes, there'd been an attorney general, but he was the presidential lawyer. The role was different. So at any rate, you now have a Justice Department and an activist. And Grant also had the support of Congress, which is still dominated by people who were called radicals. What radical then meant was people in politics who supported a vigorous Reconstruction and civil rights for African Americans. Forget what the way the word is used today. It had a more specific meaning. And this is Ben Butler, who had a pretty bad rep as a general during the war. He was a very bad general. It was deserved. He wasn't very good. But he was a brilliant lawyer, and there's much to say about him. He was a Boston politician in civilian life, and elected to Congress after the war. He went from having been a pre-war Democrat, who actually put Jefferson Davis's name into nomination for the Democratic nomination for president at the 1860 convention, to becoming a very ardent, articulate, and forceful radical within Congress. Okay, and he was the most, along with Charles Sumner, also from Massachusetts, and Thaddeus Stevens, until Stevens died in '68. But Butler lives longer than either of those men. Advocate for vigorous legislation against the Klan and for enforcement of the protections of the 14th Amendment. Congress passes 3 enforcement acts, sometimes called the Ku Klux Klan Acts. They are very precisely drawn to define as federal crimes. This is radical. The federal government was not perceived until then as having the authority to override state law and to enforce the Bill of Rights. It was assumed to be only a state responsibility to enforce or not enforce the Bill of Rights. And there's later, I'm not going to get into that, a few years later, there's a series of Supreme Court decisions which reverse this and say, no, it's only up to the states. And that's why, by the way, during the Jim Crow era, federal law doesn't get enforced in the South, because it's once again defined by very conservative Supreme Court as state responsibility, not federal. But during this period, it's a federal responsibility. And it liberates Grant to act. And the other component of this war against the Klan is the military part. This guy, Lewis Merrill, remarkable guy, fascinating man. He was from Pennsylvania. He was a West Pointer. He led federal troops in Missouri during the war, chasing down people like Quantrill, Confederate guerrillas. He was very good at it, very good at it. He was also a lawyer. And he was a major in the 7th Cavalry, which is sent south. Yes, that's the same 7th Cavalry that belonged to General Custer and that will be demolished at the Battle of the Little Bighorn a few years later. Anyway, Grant dispatches Merrill. First, he did later serve in Mississippi, by the way, and Louisiana. But initially, it's South Carolina. Why there? Because upcountry South Carolina is perceived to be the most Klan-saturated part of the former Confederate states. With more than 50%, sometimes 60% of white males in some certain counties belong to the Klan. And in the course of about a year's work, Merrill breaks the Klan in South Carolina. How does he do it? It's a long story. I'm not going to tell you the whole story because you want to go home at some point. You'll be here until 2 a.m. But he was very successful, as he was with Confederate guerrillas during the war, penetrating the Klan with intelligence agents, both black and white. How could black spies penetrate the Klan? Well, African Americans worked on the farms of people who were in the Klan, and they brought him everything that they heard. They were absolutely invaluable. He writes about all this in his reports, which are in the National Archives. It's fascinating. He's a good writer, too, which made him a pleasure to write about. Very easily quotable. And he recruited turncoat Klansmen, and he arrested them by the hundreds. And he had so penetrated the Klan that whole clans came in. A Klan was generally about 10 to 20 members. But a county might have a dozen or 20 different clans or dens. Anyway, whole dens came in together. The leaders fled. They were the men who had a little money. They got out of town. They fled to Canada. They fled to Texas, points west. And in court, a lot of Klansmen gave testimony against their friends. This is all on record, and the court records are fascinating. The Klan's secret signs and passwords were exposed, and just in South Carolina, about 5,000 men were indicted. Just South Carolina. Similar campaigns are taking place elsewhere. And here in Mississippi, the U.S. Attorney for the northern part of the state, a man named G. Wiley Wells, very, very aggressive federal prosecutor, reported in about a 6-month period, 488 indictments and another 200 arrested. And the federal attorney for the southern part of the state indicted another 152 there. Why so many more in the north than the south of Mississippi? I don't really know. Whether Wells was just a more aggressive prosecutor than Jacobson, the guy in the south, or whether the Klan was that much more thick on the ground in the north. Okay, so the Klan is beaten. The Klan is beaten. There were prosecutions that go on for months and months. What happens? And I'm going to try to compress a lot here, because I very much want to take questions from the floor. So I'm going to shrink down some of the things I had to say here. And let's just say with Adelbert Ames here, you all know who he was. His ouster, the coup against Ames, and it was a coup basically, 1875, was a watershed in the rollback of Reconstruction. So-called Redeemer movements are active in virtually all the former Confederate states, with one exception, that's Virginia. It's another separate story. But what's going on? We tend to think of 1877, the result of the 1876 election, as the end of Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877, a supposed backroom deal. Republican governments will be recognized in the last 3 states where they have any power. In return, federal troops will be pulled out of the South. This is a bit of a myth. It didn't quite happen like that. Because there are very few federal troops to pull out anymore. I told you that earlier. There are never many to pull out. But they are confined to barracks after that event. In other words, they will not be used to enforce the 14th Amendment anymore. But the pivotal event here was really the election of 1874. What happened then? 74, it's not a presidential year. Democrats won control of the House of Representatives for the first time since before the war. And the House of Representatives controls the purse strings. Congress would no longer pay for federal prosecutors or troops. And Grant's hands were shackled after that. There's more to say. The support for Reconstruction faded in the North. People were tired of voters were tired of the South's problems. There was no public support for protecting Adelbert Ames. And I'm going to end with this. John Lynch, some of you probably know who he was, others maybe not. He was and technically a 2-term congressman, Reconstruction congressman. He's African American. And he tried to persuade Grant to send more troops into Mississippi to save Ames. He was a dignified guy. I was going to say begged. Well, he was begging in principle, but don't imagine a man demeaning himself that way. It was and Grant told him, Lynch said, Grant said it was his duty on one side, he felt his duty on one side and party obligation on the other. If I believed that I could have saved Mississippi, I would have done it. And when this got back to Ames wrote to his wife, he said, "Why should I fight a hopeless battle for 2 more years when no possible good to the Negro or anyone else could result?" And what happened here in Mississippi was replicated in other states. It became the template for counter-revolution. But I'm going to leave you with him for a particular reason. Lynch was essentially deprived of his seat in Congress, as happened to black representatives all across the former Confederate States. He was a lawyer. He practiced law in Mississippi. And then he decided there's no future for me here. He moved to Chicago. He had a very long life. He lived to about 1930-something. And in 1928, if I have the year correct, he became the advisor to the first black individual elected to Congress since Reconstruction in Chicago. And he is a bridge, a personal bridge between Reconstruction and the embryonic era of 20th century civil rights. And he never gave up. There were others like him too. Never gave up advocating for what he knew had been promised and was required by the Constitution during Reconstruction. So I had lots more to say, but you're not going to hear it. But I'm very eager to hear you. There's a microphone floating around back there.
We have just a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has one, raise your hand. We'll bring it to you.
Thank you very much. It's not really a question, it's a comment. You mentioned about the Joint Committee reports and they're online, but how hard they are to read. Published copies of many of those years are available at the State Archives Library. Just go over and ask for them to be pulled. And they are really interesting reading. You're right.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, you of course you have them here. Most places don't have them, which is why I mentioned. Yes, there they are. They are fascinating reading. And I probably overstated the difficulty of reading them. I just felt as if I was going blind because I was reading 6,000 pages of it. And they're 2 big fat volumes just on Mississippi, about 800 pages or something like that, maybe 900, just Mississippi.
We have a question from the live stream. Sarah Campbell asks, do you know of examples of places Nathan Bedford Forrest appeared in Mississippi to organize Klan groups?
Well, I'd like to rather grandly say, well, of course, but I'm not on the tip of my tongue, frankly, because my book deals with the entire set of former Confederate states. And I believe in the book I mention at least a couple of such locations. So I'm going to disappoint that questioner, but I'm not going to just ad lib on that one.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour. I'll bet if there are more questions, Fergus would be glad to answer them. We have copies of the book for sale. I've been reading it. It is fantastic. Come back Sunday for the Fannie Lou Hamer birthday commemoration with Mr. Charles McLaurin. That'll be well worth your time. Come back next week when we'll have Michael Streisguth to talk to us about the Atomic Alert exhibit. One more time, help me thank Fergus Bordewich for this fantastic program today.